Many people in my generation have a fondness, as I do, for a 1983 film called The Big Chill. The Big Chill tells the story of a group of friends who attend the University of Michigan together in the late 1960s and formed those intense bonds of friendships that happen among people in college. But The Big Chill revisits them 15 years later. Now they are no longer the wild-eyed, idealistic young persons that they were in a time of great fervent and protest. They're now living decidedly corporatist lives, stuff they thought they would never do. And they're distant from each other. They communicate by telephone. This is 1983, so it's before text and Facebook and all of those things. So what brings the group together for the first time since they graduated 15 years ago is one of their group members, Alex, commits suicide. And it's in the town where one of the family members live in South Carolina. So the film opens with everyone first getting the news over the telephone to the marvelous sound of Marvin Gaye singing "I Heard It Through the Grapevine." And then we get into the church, this little Protestant-looking church somewhere in South Carolina. You can instantly tell the characters, since we know they met in the 60s, feel oddly placed in the church. It's like not the kind of thing they would have done in college. Does anybody go to church in college? Some people do. Most people don't, though, you know. So there they are in a church. And I've presided over enough funerals. I know how awkward funerals and weddings can be for people who normally don't find themselves in a church. It feels strange to them. They're not quite sure of the customs and the gestures. You really see that in the faces of this cast as they assemble into the church. I've seen it before. The minister is preaching and he says what I would never say in a funeral, but he says, "I never really knew Alex." Then he proceeded to say something about him, which would be inane, since he had never really known him. So basically, the funeral is just simply not doing it. It just doesn't. It's whatever it is. It's a funeral. Well, it's not even Catholic, so it's even, I say, worse. It's just a bad funeral service. Why this is in the front of the film, though, is what happens next. The minister then says that Karen, who's one of the members of the cast, we'll meet her in the show, in the movie. Karen is now going to come forward and play one of Alex's favorite songs, is what she says. She moves up to the organ in the church and starts playing. And like organ music now, organist is in New Orleans tonight, so he can't defend himself, but they're notorious for starting to play something that they know exactly what they're playing, and no one else can quite pick it out. And they'll say to them, did you see? That's so obvious. That's what this is. So when it starts, you just think you're hearing generic Protestant church organ music that's equally not suited to this occasion of people who don't darken the door of a church, when they're sitting there. But as you listen more carefully, as the soundtrack picks up, you realize you're hearing the opening notes of the Rolling Stones, who are singing "You Can't Always Get What You Want." Each of the cast members begin to smile, and then as the scene finishes, they get up out of the church. The song is still playing, not Karen on the organ. The song now is in the soundtrack. You're hearing the Rolling Stones. And as they drive towards the funeral home and then go to the house where the reception is going to be, you hear the entirety of that song. Many people think it's a masterful film opening because the thing about The Big Chill, it reintroduced so many people to the great music of the 1960s, and it really deals with that thing about how we have idealistic memories of our past and how things look so different in our adult years. It's just simply a wonderful film, and I thought a great way to open a homily about the miraculous feeding of the 5,000. Hopefully you'll see why as I move through this. Now, I mentioned to you at the very beginning that we read from John because intentionally for the next 4 weeks, including tonight, 5 weeks altogether, we will hear St. John's unique treatment on what's called the bread of life. Jesus saying, "I am the bread come down from heaven. Anyone who eats this bread will live with me for eternity." There's a unique passage that's only found in this gospel, and they really undergird our Eucharistic faith. Unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John tells his story about Eucharist at the miraculous feeding, which is why we're hearing it this evening. The other three will tell it at the place you would expect to find it, at the Last Supper, right before the death of Jesus. Oddly enough, in John's Gospel, when they go to the Last Supper, he mentions, of course, that there's having Eucharist, but he focuses exclusively on what happens afterwards when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples and tells everyone to do the same. So we're getting the Holy Thursday story smack dab in the middle of summer because John places it much earlier in his narrative. Now, the miracle story is, I'm sure, well known to you, as you heard it again tonight. It's got two characters that they're apostles. We should point them out, Philip and Andrew. They are the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of this particular gospel. In all the gospels, they have very few things to say, and when they do, it doesn't seem to go well, and they just seem to add to it. But they're therefore important. They're not just filler. They're there for important reasons. Here's what we need to know. Where we last left last Sunday when I preached to you, we were finishing Mark, and the disciples had been out on ministry and were exhausted, and Jesus wanted to take them to a place of rest. So they got into a boat, went across the Sea of Galilee, where no one else was going to be. Unbeknownst to them, the entire crowd followed them, and there was even more of them than there were before. And you can imagine the disciples who need this rest suddenly seeing this enormous crowd. And when Jesus sees at the climactic moment where we interrupt our reading of the Gospel of Mark, he's moved with pity because he sees them as sheep without a shepherd. And it concludes, he began to teach them many things. Even though this is the Gospel of John and that was the Gospel of Mark, they're actually describing the same event. John places the miracle story where he does, but it's the same thing. The apostles come across the boat, but you just missed the context. It's obviously there in Mark. And when they arrive, there's a large crowd. And now some very practical considerations come into play. Jesus knows they've come a long way, and there's no food nearby, and they're going to need nourishment. And so he asks Philip, can they find something so everyone can have something to eat? The only thing Philip knows to say is that 200 days of our wage would not be enough to give them even a little. Let me retranslate that for you. No, there's no way we can feed all of these people. And then Andrew then points out, but he's trying to point out to show that they're in desperate straits. He said, well, there's a little boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Jesus does not comment on that. He simply orders Philip and Andrew to have everybody be seated. Then you hear the rest of the story. Everyone is seated, and then the food is distributed, and they don't run out of bread and they don't run out of fish. Everyone has as much as they could possibly want, and then there are 12 wicker baskets left full of fragments, one for each apostle. Every time I hear this story, I wonder, where on God's earth did they find the wicker baskets? And does each apostle have a name on there or something? It's a detail thrown in there and then discarded, but there it is. The clear imagery, though, about what Jesus is really doing with his feeding. Of course, we'd all like to know the mechanics of the feeding. How did this happen? Is this possible? There's no rational scientific explanation of how 5 barley loaves. Barley does go a long way, but it doesn't go a lot. 5 loaves will not feed thousands upon thousands of people, and 2 fish can only go so far. So obviously, we're stretched beyond our rationality. So the feeding that takes place is mysterious, and we have to look to John's first miracle story earlier in this gospel. When I begin the story, you'll instantly know what it is. There was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and Jesus and his mother were there. You know that wedding. That's the wedding where famously they run out of wine in the middle of the wedding, a ceremony of the wedding reception, which means that the reception is going to be a disaster. There's going to be no hospitality to the guests. And Mary then tells Jesus that they have no wine, and he doesn't seem to think his time has come, so he says that to her, but she simply turns to the head waiter and says, do whatever he tells you. And again, without any explanation, the head waiter then simply draws water from these enormous water jugs, and the head waiter learns that it's the choicest wine they've ever served. He can't explain it, he doesn't understand it. How was it that the best could be saved for last? Don't you see now, both of these stories, the wedding feast at Cana and the miracle of the feeding of the thousands, operate without any sense of understanding how it happens. Some people say, well, here's what really happened with the miraculous feeding of the thousands. I don't know how this works on the wine, but they think it works on the bread and the fish. It says that everybody brought food because they're smart enough to bring food, but nobody had enough to go around, and they were afraid. And once the little boy did this kind gesture and brought his 5 loaves and his 2 fish forward, and by the way, it doesn't say he willingly parted with them. You just assume that, for the way this narrative of the story is going, that everyone felt so touched by this gesture that they started sharing amongst themselves. That's not why John is telling this story. He is telling this story because he's illustrating a miracle. Need that distraction. That theory simply holds no scriptural weight. The other part is perhaps it's some type of magic. And for many people, that's what sacraments seem like to them. Magic. Now, if you know a little bit about magic, you know that the magician must use misdirection in order to accomplish his or her work. The idea is not that, I won't say magic is deceptive, although it kind of is, it's sleight of hand, but misdirection means that your attention's focused on one thing while something else is happening. Your brain can only handle so much stimuli in a particular moment. And so the magician, through misdirection, is able to somehow do something that you can't see them do it. Often that's misunderstood as the Eucharist behind the altar. I'm certainly the magician's gown, I suppose, if you want to call this green vestment that, but the reality is that my view from the altar is no different than your view of the altar. Well, mine is a different view, but we see the same thing. I see what you see, which is the bread that we use for consecration. The bread, by the way, that's bought from a warehouse, and it's relatively inexpensive, so to speak, at least each person's communion, a handful of pennies at the most. And the wine, when we're able to distribute it, is in a case with screw-off tops. That should tell you something. It's not choice vintage. It's, again, relatively inexpensive. I see what you see, relatively inexpensive bread and wine. And while I say the prayers and try to use the dramatic gesture of the Holy Spirit descending upon the gifts, the reality is my gesture is illustrative. It accomplishes nothing. My words are illustrative. They, in and of themselves, accomplish nothing. Outside our perception, not by misdirection, but by God's intention, outside our perception, the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Jesus Christ. This is how the miracle happens at Cana, and this is how the miracle happens on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And the thing we need to know about both of those miracles were they were a one-time event. Any wedding that didn't have enough wine after Cana still ran out of wine. And if a crowd, people followed an itinerant preacher somewhere out to a deserted place, they'd be on their own for their food. You see, those were one-off miracles, a very important part of the story. So where does that leave us? Well, the whole reason that the stories are there is that 2,000 years later, we are the recipients of that miracle. In fact, it's the best way to understand Eucharist, what it is that we're sharing together. It's a miracle. It is a sacrament. We call it that. A sacrament doesn't just explain away what's taking place. A sacrament really announces it's God's action, and God's action happens outside of our field of perception. Therefore, it can be only embraced by our faith. And our rational minds trying to figure out how on heaven's earth can those inert substances, bread and wine, become something organic, the living, a resurrected body and blood of Jesus Christ. We will find no particular suitable answer. And so the Eucharist is a miracle, but unlike the miracle at Cana, and unlike the miracle on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, it's a miracle that is repeated. Every time the church gathers together to celebrate Eucharist, the miracle happens again. You see, Jesus understood that we would need nourishment in our journey, spiritual nourishment. And so unlike the other sacraments, which are designed to happen in most cases only one time in our life, the other on a very limited basis, reconciliation and Eucharist are infinitely repeatable. And in each case, we have a new celebration, but it's of the same thing. The same miracle happens again and again and again because he says we need this bread for the journey. Seeing it once is marvelous enough, but seeing it on a regular basis is even better. It feeds our faith. You might say it nourishes our faith. It comes down, and this crowd that gathers together is a good illustration of it, of the difference between wanting something and needing something. I'm like the rest of you. I use the terms interchangeably. Most people do. They're really not meant to be. Want means you desire something. Need means it's essential that you have it. Frequently, our desires so capture our mind that we think the want means the need, when in reality it isn't. It turns out you and I are not very good at determining what we need. We're really good about saying what we want, but we're not really clear that it's good for us, that it's going to turn out well for us, and in most cases, by the way, it does not. I was telling my sister about this homily today because I had teased on Facebook about using the big chill, and she wanted to know what the story was. And when I mentioned this wanted need thing to her, she reminded me of the little boy that lived across the street because he could never pronounce my name, Gary. So he would call me Gidi. G-I-D-I. You know that's going to stick once people hear that. The family will still sometimes call me that. And I'm risking everything telling you that tonight. But he would say Gidi. But the other thing remembered about him, when my sisters babysat him, he would insist on food that his mother didn't want him to have. She was very specific about his snacks. And he would constantly, particularly wanting peanut butter, he would say, I need peanut butter. We always remember that about him. In his mind, this was an absolute necessity. He could not distinguish between the want and the need. And I'm saying you and I can't do that either. We're really not able to do that. You know, when my mother and dad were gravely ill, first of all, I wanted it to go away. Who wouldn't want that, right? And then when it didn't go away, I wanted it to end quickly so they wouldn't be miserable. No control over either of those things. They seem, and many of you have been in the same situation, perfectly good things to pray about. From our limited perspective, there seems to be no particular good reason for what's happening because we don't have the fullness. The field of perception is limited, much like it is in that miracle story, that we have to basically surrender that back to God. And let's face it, that's just really hard for you and I. The miracle stories show that God certainly knows our wants, but even more importantly, it shows He knows our needs, and He fulfills every one of them. There you have now the theological basis for the institution of the Eucharist. It is God giving us the nourishment we need so that one day we can be with Him in heaven. If you need a more poetic version, let me finish with this one. The song that so enshrines that scene at the beginning of The Big Chill is a Rolling Stones song. You can't always get what you want. Whoever thought that the Rolling Stones were philosophers or theologians? I'm not even sure they self-understand them. But their words, I think, clearly make this a poetic way to finish what we're thinking about this evening. It says, you can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. But if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need.